Hello, friends, and welcome to another edition of Book Reviews. Today is Sunday, July 29th, 2018, on the Gregorian calendar, and it's been several months since the last set of book reviews, so we have a lot of books to get through. So let's get started. This is a book called Roberta Flack. It's about the singer Roberta Flack. I have been studying soul music and listening to it pretty intently for the past 3 years or so, but I hadn't really done any study of Miss Flack until I heard a song come on one of my YouTube stations. I was like, who is this? I have to learn more. So I looked on Amazon, and this is actually a children's book. It's like young adults, but it gives a little overview of her life, and it's got some really nice like watercolor art inside, which is nice. So Roberta Flack. Speaking of music and continuing my study of country music, this book is called Tennessee Strings. It's by Charles K. Wolfe, who is a historian of music, and this really goes to the origins of country music in Tennessee, starting with gospel and the fiddlers, it kind of getting into up until the days of the Grand Ole Opry. So I learned a lot about country music that I didn't know before. This is very short, but it's a pretty decent overview of how it all began back in Tennessee. So this is Tennessee Strings. I was continuing my study of Tennessee. I just went in to see what other books I had. This is called Tennessee's Indian Peoples, and it kind of focuses on that arbitrary boundary of what's today Tennessee. So it talks about the Cherokee, it talks about the Chickasaw and the Creeks mostly, and it talks about removal. There's not really much information in this book that you can't get from other books, especially about the Cherokee. But if you're really interested in just who the native peoples of Tennessee are, and it's short, it's not a bad read. Then I read this book called Evicted, which is by a guy named Matthew Desmond. He's a sociologist, and he studied the phenomenon of eviction in the city of Milwaukee, like the mid-90s to the mid-aughts or so. And reading this one, obviously, in the context of the tenants' rights struggle and struggle for rent control in the city of Pomona. Very interesting. Looks at also the racial dynamic, because Milwaukee is a very segregated city, so it's going on in both black and white communities, and a lot of the things that are going on or were going on at this time in Milwaukee we see every day here in our communities in Pomona and the Inland Empire. Yeah, very informative, and he doesn't really talk much about rent control, but he comes down in favor of a universal housing voucher like they have in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. So I think that might be a good, partial approach to resolving the housing issue. But ultimately, of course, the land is stolen, and the commodification of the land is really, part of that original sin. So it needs to be decommodified, both land and housing. That's what really needs to happen. But it's a good read about, puts a very human face on this problem. This one is a book that I picked up kind of randomly at the Upland Public Library. It's called The Assassination of Julius Caesar. It's by Michael Parenti, and he looks at the assassination of Julius Caesar basically with from the point of view of materialism, historical materialism. He's a Marxist, and so he's very critical of the Roman historians of that time, or afterwards. Because they have an inherent class interest, because that's where they're coming from, so they write in a way that's against the people, in a perspective, and so he kind of turns that on its head, questions the sources, and talks about Caesar as his assassination as being basically the elite of Rome doing what they can to stop popular reforms from going in. And it's also mentioned that ancient Rome had rent control because of people's struggles, specifically in the city of Rome. And I thought that was really interesting. Some people are like, oh, it's after Prop 13 or in New York, whatever. But this is a very, very old concept of having some kind of pricing controls because housing is just too important. So it's interesting, kind of new, or it's not that new, but the way that he approaches the history is made it very, very interesting. So this was interesting. Continuing with the study of country music, this book is called Pride. It's Charlie Pride's autobiography, although he did write it with somebody. And this is a interesting story. Charlie Pride's still alive. He talks, but more than half of the book is about baseball. Seems like he was destined for greatness in something, and it just wasn't going to be baseball. But he's obviously a very talented singer. Talks about him, living in Montana, playing the honky tonks out here in the West, before getting recruited to Nashville. Talks about his manic depression, which was what they called bipolar disorder at the time, and how he came through that health struggle, and ended up being very successful. He's a golf lover. He owns part of a bank. So he, was one of these people that really experienced social mobility, came out of, sharecropping parents in Sledge, Mississippi, and now is at the top of his game, pretty much. One of the things he doesn't mention is that the songs that he sings, he doesn't write. But it's an interesting look at the career of the very first, well, not the very first, according to this other Tennessee book, but the first major African-American country singer. Star. Continuing our study of music and also of Cuba, we've been reading a lot about Cuba lately, this is Celia Cruz's autobiography, and this one is in Spanish. We read this in Spanish. Read this together with my partner, and it was actually kind of disappointing read. The first part is much more interesting when she's still in Cuba, when she's talking about her youth and growing up and that sort of thing. But there's a lot of political invective against the Castros in Cuba, and also just a lot of she talks a lot about all the awards she's won and how she has all these famous friends, and all of that stuff is just really not that interesting, and it really makes it seem like she's full of herself. And I think she probably was during life. I'm a Celia fan. I love Celia's music. La Vida es un Carnaval. I'm all about it, especially the early stuff when she's singing in Lucumí and stuff like that. But this book is, unless you're a diehard Celia fan and you really need to know, this is not really worth your time. Continuing on Cuba, this is Race to Revolution, which is by Dr. Gerald Horne. This is the first book I've read by Gerald Horne, even though I have several other of his books, some of which he has signed for me. He's got this dedication. I listened to KPFK a lot, and Margaret Prescott interviews him a lot. He used to be on Dion Kamati's show a lot. So when I read the book, it's almost like I can hear his voice, doing the narration, which is a very nice touch. It makes it a little bit more personal. And when you read this book, you're really just impressed by Dr. Horne's scholarship. I mean, he has read every newspaper, every archive of anybody, that had every politician and president and military general and diplomat, and all of the memoirs of anybody of any significance, everything Frederick Douglass ever wrote, Martin Delaney, in everything in English and Spanish, and it's just an vastly encyclopedic knowledge of the transatlantic African colonial world, and it seems like he just uses all that knowledge and then just pops out book after book after book, year after year after year. He writes like 2 or 3 books a year. I can't keep up, but sometimes it gets a little bit convoluted because you really have to follow his reasoning, and he uses a lot of euphemisms. But this is a very, very impressive work, and basically talks about, to me, it answers the question, what is the connection between Cuba and the United States, especially the United States South? And it's very, very intriguing the way that, especially folks in the South, they wanted to annex Cuba, to have another 2 or 3 slave states, to have more votes, and, in the Congress and whatnot, and how... Texas, people were being smuggled through Texas because Texas, had broken off of Mexico. White settlers did that and whatnot. Really, really interesting book. So if you're interested in Cuba or the South, U.S. South, and the relationship there between, definitely read this one, and when you get a chance, read the rest of Dr. Horne's books. This is a book that I posted about on Facebook. It's called The Abstract One by Bernart Harris. Bernart Harris is one of the workers at the Day Labor Center, and I just really appreciate the fact that he, like a lot of the other workers, have talents to share. It's self-published, so I also got to give him props for doing it DIY. Excuse me. He has a lot of books, poems about what was going on in LA when he was growing up. A lot of poems about desire, and hopefully maybe we can get him to do a recitation or some kind of event where he will sign these books. He signed this one for me. At a local event or something like that. But major props to the brother Bernard. He's an African-American worker at the center. This book is called Cuba and Angola. It's published by Pathfinder Press, which is basically the publishing arm of the Socialist Workers' Party and that tendency. So in many ways it does function as a piece of propaganda for socialism and for the Cuban government. But it also tells a story that is not really accessible in many other ways, which is the struggle of the Angolese people for freedom from the aggressions of the South African apartheid government right after they won their independence from Portugal. So and it is. I think it is very, very heroic what the Cuban troops were able to do and help in helping the Angolans secure their freedom, and ultimately that played a big role in helping the apartheid to fall in South Africa. So it's written by Villegas, who was one of the military leaders in the Cuban army, and I believe he's still alive too. So interesting. Is it kind of asking that question? What is the connection between Cuba and Angola, or Cuba and Africa? So since I was reading about Angola, I decided to also read this book. It's pretty much the only other book about Angola I have in my library, The Portuguese Conquest of Angola by David Birmingham. This one's pretty old. It was published in '65. And it covers a long period of time from like 1483 to 1790. So it's very, very cursory kind of overview of what that process of colonization looked like in Angola. And it also has a lot to do with what was going on in Congo. So it was something that I was pretty ignorant about before reading this book, and did shed some light on that subject. So, and it's also pretty short, which is helpful to get through a topic, a book in a very short amount of time. Portuguese Conquest of Angola. And the other book that I read during this last couple of months is called Ancient Mesoamerica. The subtitle is A Comparison of Change in Three Regions, and the three regions they're talking about here are the eastern lowlands of Guatemala and kind of the Yucatan Peninsula, the Mayan area, the Valley of Oaxaca, and the Valley of Mexico. So this book is, I think it came out in the 90s, but still pretty up to date in terms of the fact that these group of archaeologists, they are compiling and analyzing multiple studies that have been done in these three regions, and broadening their study from just like where the treasure is, where the elites are, where the rulers are, where the big monuments are, and that sort of thing, to general residential areas, agricultural areas, because that helps create a better understanding of what was going on in a large and throughout the settlement area, and also over a very, very long period of time. So they make these comparisons of these three regions. And what's interesting to me as a political activist is that the way that anthropologists look at different ways that humans structure society, and the state being one of those structures, and one of the questions that anthropologists are constantly trying to answer is, where did the state originate? How did the state originate? Why? Under what circumstances? And there's examples of, plenty of examples in different cultures and different times of where people were living very, very happily without any kind of state at all. But in all three of these regions, states did develop. So they look at it more like, not so much as like a value issue, like value question, like should there be a state or not, so much as like, how and why they've come about, under what circumstances. So that's interesting, also very, very interesting to know, and that people can get along very well without the state. So this was kind of a thick read. The first chapter is all about their methodology, and it's a little bit of a different, difficult to wade through, but it does help you give you an understanding of how this group of archaeologists is coming to the conclusions that they're coming to. So this is kind of related to the studies that I was making last year on the Mesoamerican calendar, especially the sacred calendar. It doesn't really talk a lot about the calendar in any detail, but it does help place those studies of the calendar within a larger, framework of these cultures. If you're into Mesoamerica and into archaeology, definitely it's worth taking a look at this book. So these are the last set of books that we have. I just want to add a couple of things. The ones that are about music, not all of them, but I started with Pride. As I was going through, as he would mention specific songs, I would add them to a YouTube playlist. So now I have a YouTube playlist called Pride that has all the songs that are mentioned in this book in order. And so, I'll post a link to it in the comments of the video, so y'all can listen to the songs on this book, Pride. I wish I had done it for Tennessee Strings or the Celia book, but I didn't. But from here on out, any of my music books, I'm going to be making YouTube playlists. So look for one coming soon about Aretha's, on Aretha's autobiography. So that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. And if you have any comments, feedback, suggestions, please feel free to read them in the comments, leave them in the comments, or send me a message. Much love. Peace.